The Kidnapping of Freddy Heineken, a deeper dive into the criminal minds behind the plot. On November 9th, 1983, the unthinkable happened in the heart of Amsterdam. Freddy Heineken, the CEO of one of the world's largest brewing companies, was kidnapped in broad daylight. The abduction of the Heineken beer empire magnate and his chauffeur, Ab Doderer, would go on to become one of the most notorious kidnapping cases in history. The story that gripped the Netherlands and the world didn't just revolve around the immense ransom demand, but also around the masterminds behind the crime, Willem Holleder, Cor van Hout, and their gang. This blog takes a closer look at the plot, the criminal masterminds behind the operation, and the aftermath that shook the criminal underworld in the Netherlands. The rise of Willem Holleder and Cor van Hout. Willem Holleder and Cor van Hout, two lifelong friends from the working-class neighborhoods of Amsterdam, were the central figures in the Heineken kidnapping. Growing up in a rough environment with limited opportunities, both men were drawn to crime from an early age. By the early 1980s, they had become prominent players in the Dutch underworld, engaging in small-time robberies and extortion schemes. What set Holleder and Van Hout apart was their ambition. They didn't want to remain small-time crooks. Their idea to kidnap a high-profile target for an enormous ransom emerged as a way to gain not only money, but power and notoriety. They set their sights on Freddy Heineken, one of the wealthiest and most recognizable businessmen in the Netherlands, planning the perfect crime. The Heineken kidnapping was no spur-of-the-moment crime. It was the product of nearly 2 years of careful planning. Holleder, Van Hout, and their gang meticulously studied Heineken's daily routine, his movements around Amsterdam, and his security arrangements. Every aspect of the operation was carefully mapped out, from the moment of abduction to the hiding place for their captives. In total, the gang consisted of 5 men: Willem Holleder, Cor van Hout, Jan Bullard, Frans Meyer, and Martin Erkamps. Each played a specific role in the execution of the plot. Bullard and Meyer were responsible for creating the makeshift prison where Heineken and his chauffeur would be held, while Erkamps provided logistical support. One of the most critical elements of the plan was the location where the captives would be hidden. The gang rented an old warehouse on the outskirts of Amsterdam, where they constructed 2 soundproof cells inside the building. These cells were small, dark, and equipped with only the barest essentials, designed to isolate the hostages completely and prevent them from escaping or alerting anyone to their location. The kidnapping. On November 9th, 1983, the plan went into action. The kidnappers had studied Freddy Heineken's daily routine closely and knew that he and his chauffeur would leave the Heineken headquarters at a specific time. As Heineken and Doderer walked toward their car, the kidnappers, disguised and armed, rushed them, forcing both men into a waiting van. The operation was swift, and within minutes, Freddy Heineken and his chauffeur had disappeared. The police were notified immediately, and the Dutch media exploded with the news of the abduction, creating a media frenzy that dominated the headlines for weeks. Meanwhile, the kidnappers transported their hostages to the prepared warehouse, where Heineken and Doderer were locked in separate cells. The kidnappers then issued their ransom demand, 35 million Dutch guilders, approximately $16 million or $19 million today, an astronomical sum that would make it one of the highest ransom demands in history at that time. The gang believed that by abducting such a high-profile figure, they would be able to secure this enormous payout without too much trouble. Inside the makeshift prison. For 21 days, Freddy Heineken and Ab Doderer endured harsh conditions in their cramped, isolated cells. The kidnappers kept them chained to the walls and confined them to near darkness. The only human contact they had was with their captors, who brought them minimal food and water. Despite the physical and psychological toll, Heineken, ever the businessman, maintained his composure and complied with the kidnappers' instructions. He even used his time in captivity to contemplate business decisions, reflecting his unbreakable willpower. The kidnappers communicated with Heineken's family through a series of coded messages, demanding the ransom while attempting to throw the police off their trail. The gang believed they had planned the perfect crime, and for a time, it seemed like they might succeed. But cracks began to appear in their operation as the police intensified their investigation. The investigation, a race against time. As soon as the kidnapping occurred, Dutch authorities launched one of the largest manhunts in the country's history. With the media watching closely, police scoured Amsterdam and the surrounding areas, searching for clues. The ransom demand had been made, but the police were determined to track down the criminals before they could collect the money and disappear. Key to the investigation's success was a combination of forensic evidence, witness statements, and old-fashioned police work. Eventually, authorities managed to narrow down the possible locations where the captives could be held. A crucial breakthrough came when they discovered the warehouse in which Heineken and his chauffeur were being kept. Using intelligence from informants, police moved in on the hideout. On November 30th, 1983, almost 3 weeks after the abduction, police raided the warehouse, rescuing Heineken and Doderer. Both men were found alive, though understandably shaken by the ordeal. The kidnapping was over, but the search for the kidnappers was far from complete. The manhunt for the kidnappers. Despite the successful rescue, Holleder, Van Hout, and the rest of the gang initially managed to evade capture. After collecting the ransom, they fled the Netherlands, hoping to enjoy their newfound wealth in anonymity. However, international law enforcement agencies soon became involved, and the hunt for the criminals spanned multiple countries. Frans Meyer was the first to be caught, arrested in France shortly after the crime. Jan Bollaert and Martin Aerkamps were also apprehended within a few months. However, the two masterminds, Willem Holleder and Cor van Hout, remained on the run for several years, traveling between countries to avoid capture. In 1984, both men were finally arrested in Paris, following a coordinated effort between Dutch and French police. After a lengthy legal battle, they were extradited to the Netherlands, where they faced trial for their roles in the Heineken kidnapping. Trial and sentencing. In 1987, Willem Holleder, Cor van Hout, and the rest of the gang were put on trial. The trial was a media spectacle, with the Dutch public keen to see justice served for the brazen crime. All of the kidnappers were found guilty and sentenced to lengthy prison terms. Holleder and Van Hout, as the leaders of the gang, received the heaviest sentences, though they would not remain behind bars for long. After serving just a few years of their sentences, both Holleder and Van Hout were released on parole. Their criminal careers, however, were far from over. The aftermath. A life of crime. The Heineken kidnapping was just the beginning for Willem Holleder. Following his release, Holleder became one of the most infamous figures in the Dutch underworld. He was implicated in a series of murders, extortion plots, and other criminal activities throughout the 1990s and 2000s. His violent reputation earned him the nickname De Neus, the Nose, and he became a dominant force in organized crime in the Netherlands. Cor van Hout also continued his life of crime after his release, though his story came to a tragic end. In 2003, Van Hout was gunned down in Amsterdam in a suspected gangland execution, a fate that befell many of his associates as well. Willem Holleder, on the other hand, remained a powerful figure in the Dutch criminal world for decades. In 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison for his involvement in 5 murders, marking the end of his reign as one of the most notorious criminals in Dutch history. Conclusion. The kidnapping of Freddy Heineken remains one of the most infamous abductions in history, not only for the high-profile nature of the crime, but also for the brazen ambition of the criminals behind it. Willem Holleder and Cor van Hout, the masterminds of the plot, sought to change their lives through one audacious act, but instead they became entangled in a life of crime that would ultimately lead to their downfall. Though Heineken survived the ordeal, the kidnapping left a lasting mark on Dutch society and the world. It demonstrated the lengths to which criminals would go for money and power, and showed how even the wealthiest and most influential people could become pawns in the game of organized crime. The Heineken kidnapping will forever be remembered as a watershed moment in the Netherlands' battle against organized crime, a story of ambition, greed, and eventual justice.